Well, you're going to hear it everywhere this week. President Trump marks 100 days in office. Why does 100 days even matter? As always, there's a backstory to that, and you can make up your own mind. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Well, today we're going to do something a little bit different, a little bit more casual. We're going to have coffee together. We're going to talk through this first 100 days. Typically, I have a well-scripted quick hit for you where I want to hit a couple things tightly because we want to be really efficient with your time. What I want to do today is just talk to you casually about why we even mark 100 days in office. Where does that even come from? And also explain why at Smarter News, what I'm more curious about is the next 100, even 200 days in office for President Trump. So let me just start with this. There's a little bit of a disagreement about when media organizations should mark 100 days. So today marks 100 days in office for President Trump. Some media organizations, like ours, are actually marking it today on Tuesday, but some are allowing President Trump to get through the 100th day, probably just to make sure there's not a curveball thrown somewhere in there. There's probably some wisdom to that, and they're going to mark 100 days in office on Wednesday. So you're going to hear about this a little bit throughout the entire week. And isn't it very appropriate for our times that we're not even agreeing on what day to mark the 100th day in office, but it is this week. And the reason why we mark 100 days in office is very much rooted in modern times. Let me explain. Often when we're talking about tradition, I can say to you, well, if you look at the U.S. Constitution or, back when the founders were looking at this or President Washington set this precedent. That's not the case when it comes to the media marking 100 days in office or a presidency marking 100 days in office. And I'm very skeptical of any events where the press or a politician are driving the narrative. And that's really what we do when we mark 100 days in office. It's not like the American people are keeping score up to 100 days. Maybe you are. Maybe you are keeping score at 100 days. But really, this is a moment that is created. And it dates back to the 1930s when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office for the very first time. He comes into office. We're in the years after World War I, after a pandemic, by the way, as well, in great economic turmoil, the Great Depression. And you have President Roosevelt coming in, and he had a very active first several weeks in office that were very unique to him, which I'll explain in a moment. And since that time, we've started to look at 100 days of a presidency using that as a barometer, which isn't a great barometer because it was such a unique time in history. There was so much going on. President Roosevelt also did something very, very unique to the presidency. And for the very first time, he spoke to the American public directly through the radio. So he harnessed media to go direct to consumer. Sound familiar? We're doing it in a different way here with social media. But this was new for the president to do that, speak directly to the American people, talk about the problems that the country as a whole was facing, and talk about how he was going to solve these problems. He was a very popular president. He's the only president in American history that was reelected 4 times. He didn't serve out his 4th term. And now we have a constitutional amendment that prevents a president being elected so frequently or in these consecutive terms. But it was a very unique point in American history for many different reasons. So comparing future presidents to President Roosevelt can be difficult. But this is where we get that look at a presidency. What does it look like in the first 100 days? And in many ways, it's just an arbitrary deadline. It's not something that is rooted in anything more than what sort of reflection we could have in the last several months. So the big picture here is that this is arbitrary. And what happens in the first 100 days in office does not determine the success of an administration or a legacy. No historian has taken, at least to my knowledge, has taken the first 100th day and been able to directly draw to how the American public's going to remember a president, in part too, because different chapters in American history remember the past in very different ways. So again, big picture, very arbitrary deadline that we're looking at here, mainly manufactured by the media, as well as politicians who want to use it to their benefit. This is rooted in modern history, not going back to the founding of America. And for that reason, it's just important to be aware of this sort of excitement or talk about this is coming from that place. As long as you know it's coming from that place, you can decide how you want to look at these 100 days. What I want to do now is just talk to you a little bit about, in reflection, of what we've experienced together and why really looking to the future is where I would like to focus the efforts of Smarter News. What's significant about 100 days, because it's become a media or a political tradition is that in that 100 days when a president takes office, there's a little bit of grace extended to any administration, doesn't matter the political party, where they're able to still reference the past, the other guys that were in office and what they're trying to do to change things. Once you turn the page past 100 days, then really the administration assumes the full driver's seat of what's going on with the American public and starts owning some of the policy decisions that they're putting forward in a new way. So that is important to me as a journalist when I'm looking at how to report things for you. The first 100 days, there's a little bit of grace, a little bit of daylight. As we look to the future, now the administration's really in full control with full accountability for their actions. And when you think about what we've seen over the last several weeks, think about some of the new words or terms or topics that we've covered that we really have never covered before. We've never covered DOGE. We've never had a Department of Government Efficiency. We covered so many different decisions related to that. We haven't really in recent times, in my journalism career, talked really significantly about the Department of Education perhaps dissolving. That's something that we've talked about. We talked about USAID. How many of us talked about USAID before? Well, we talked a great deal about it at the beginning of this administration. What about the Gulf of America? What about the Gulf of America? That's something new? Are you calling it the Gulf of America, or do you still call it the Gulf of Mexico? These are some editorial decisions that everybody has to make in their own life. But here's what's significant about the next stage that we're in, the next chapter for this administration. And this is where I really want to focus. It's not just about accountability for actions that were taken in the last 100 days. This is a very sweet spot for any administration to be in, because not only are they in the driver's seat, they're not quite in an election period. So we're not quite in this period of the midterm elections. Next November, so November 2026, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, as well as a third of the Senate. When we're in an election period, politicians start making calculations based on their own political careers, not necessarily related to a new administration. And because President Trump, as a Republican, has the majority in the House and the Senate, this is a very unique time for the administration to try to advance agenda items legislatively, where they may not have that opportunity as we get more into an election year. And in general, Congress seems to do a lot less during an election year because, again, people are trying to campaign back in their home districts. They're trying to get their own policy priorities advanced and talk about that to their constituents. And so this is a very unique time period we're moving into, and it's something to watch to see, because so much of the first 100 days was focused on executive action. If we see something different in the next 100, 200 days with President Trump and Congress. So that's something I'm going to be watching. The administration is really trying to highlight two of what they say are their achievements. That is immigration as well as tariffs. These are two promises that the administration talked about during their campaigning up until election and continue to talk about now. There's a lot of debate about how successful the administration has been when it comes to the economy and when it comes to inflation. And certainly there's a lot of variables. There's also questions about the way forward for other campaign promises, for example, bringing peace to Russia and Ukraine. Those issues are unique to the border and border security and immigration in this way. There's a lot of variables, unknowns when it comes to the economy, when it comes to war and peace. When it comes to, for example, decisions made by the Supreme Court, there's a certain lack of control that the administration has over those topics. They can set forward certain policy agenda items, but how it plays out is not something they have complete control over. The border is different, though, because federal oversight at the border is unique. We have Customs and Border Protection, we have Border Patrol, and this is something that the president has talked a lot about. And if I'm thinking strategically, and I'm sort of taking a step back about what we've covered on Smarter News, as you know, we cover the border every single month. Every single month, there's a report card about what's going on at the U.S. border, who's encountered there. And I've made this a practice of our news organization because leading up to the election of 2015 and 2016, there was a surprise focus by the American people on the border. And there's an argument to be made that the border issue is what led to President Trump's first election. The border, in my experience as a journalist, and national security related to the border has a sneaky way of becoming a huge news story when people aren't watching it for most of an election period or most of a term. And so we like to keep track of it for that reason. Like, what's the bigger picture happening at the border? When push comes to shove, American voters are concerned about the economy. They're concerned about their safety, about national security, and the border combines those topics when you're talking about the economy and national security because it has to do with a lot of different topics that we're talking about in our own neighborhoods. Your ability to get a job, a good paying job. What does that look like? Your ability to make sure that your family is safe. And so we don't want to get caught off guard by border issues here at Smarter News. We want to make sure that we're paying attention. It's also a very partisan issue. There's a lot of disagreement over it. And there hasn't even been legislative agreement over it when you have the same party with the majority. So when Democrats had the majority in the House and the Senate, they weren't able to really move significant border policy. Neither were Republicans. So it's one of those issues that fascinates us, and it's something that I really want to watch. When I look at the first 100 days, that's what stands out most to me at Smarter News are the numbers at the U.S. border. And let me show you what I mean by that. It's not just about the numbers, nationwide numbers of encounters at the border. That's the northern-southern border, also our coast. That's when Border Patrol encounters someone that doesn't have legal status to be in this country, and then they have to make a decision about what happens next. So we say encountered instead of arrested as a way to sort of use an umbrella term that now multiple administrations have used. What I want to zero in on, though, is what's going on with family units and accompanied minors and unaccompanied minors at the border. So these are people traveling as a family group. It could be your uncle with a niece. It could be a cousins together. It could be a father and a son. That is determined as a family unit. You also have unaccompanied minors, which is, as it sounds, somebody 17 and younger that is traveling without an adult. When you look at these numbers and you compare them year over year in the first few months of the Trump administration, they're very significant. So unaccompanied children at the U.S. Borders, when you look at nationwide encounters, just last month, there were 702 encounters. 702 encounters. Last year, there were 8,880 in 1 month alone. That's a significant decrease. When you look at family units or accompanied minors, in March of this past year, you saw just over 1,600 encountered at our U.S. borders. Last March, it was just under 81,000. So these are drastically different numbers. And because the Trump administration has been able to move more or less unilaterally, meaning they've been able to apply border policy, enforce laws in ways that have been challenged in the courts, but those cases haven't matured. What I'm most curious about is whether or not those statistics stand. And we see this massive decline of encounters at the U.S. borders, throughout the next year or 2 years. If that's something that becomes a reality, that would be a very unique accomplishment for this administration. And it's something that they don't necessarily need Congress for. And there's a certain number of variables that they're able to control to talk about whether or not they're successful. And because the borders have a sneaky way of impacting election cycles, whether it's the midterms or presidential election cycles, I think this is a story to continue to watch. We haven't seen this. I've never seen this sort of decrease before. The question is it sustainable, and how much does it affect American voters and their perception about national security? I'm curious for you. Do you feel a difference now that you're seeing different border numbers or a different posture when it comes to border security? How much does that matter to you? I asked our Instagram community about that, and I had a lot of different responses when it comes to what stands out most to you about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Amber said it's the amount of executive orders used to bypass other legal issues. So executive orders were important to Amber. Another person wrote in and said dismantling of due process, likely related to immigration as well. Gina talked about DOGE. Heather talked about closing down a huge portion of the Mexican border. Melissa talked about the tariffs disaster as she described it. So there's a lot of different opinions when you think about, well, what stands out most to me about the first 100 days? To me, it's the border. To you, it could be something completely different. Ultimately, it's you, the voter, that the press and those in politics work for. So that really your opinion actually matters most. You're going to hear a bunch of analysis, a lot of pundits. You're going to hear President Trump talk about what he thinks you should think about for the first 100 days. The question is, what do you really think about in the first 100 days? Here's what I want you to reflect on. I mentioned President Roosevelt being very active in his first several weeks in office, and that being a barometer for future politicians. Well, one of the ways that he was active was not through executive action. He had a leadership style that enabled him to bring other Democrats along with him. And many of his movements in office happened legislatively through Congress. So it was not through executive action. That's very different than this administration that's been using executive action more than Congress to move policy along. There can be a really rich, robust debate about what's actually best for the American people and what has lasting impact and what does true American leadership look like. And that's often what we're thinking about when we're thinking about what's successful for those elected in office. It's a question of leadership. Is it a question about policy accomplishments or is it leadership style? And those two things together give us a picture of whether or not an administration is successful or whether or not an administration is not. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. We're going to mark 100 days and then we're going to move on. There's not going to be the 200. We could do a 200 day if you want to. 250? What feels good? 365? We can start a new standard. But for the first 100 days, that's what stands out most to me for the second Trump administration. And I'm curious what stands out most to you. You can send us a voice memo at hello@smarternews.com. And we'll continue to watch the developing stories throughout the week that have a lot to do with the big stories we've been talking about for the last 100 days: immigration, tariffs, and war and peace. In the meantime, thank you for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan Smarter News. Whether it's your 100th day, 200th day, 300th, whatever it is, we hope you have a good one. And we look forward to seeing you back here with more of the hard headlines tomorrow. Have a great day.